name is JD Gunter, and this is the very first live stream that I have ever done by myself. I've been on a couple of people's live streams. I have been on Peter Simeti's Comic Book Radio. I've been on Rex Christian's Devil Flyer Momentum. This is my first solo effort here. My plan is to do a few of these, maybe a month's worth, once a week. I'm going to say maybe about once a week for a month or two with just myself. If I completely run out of things to say, then I will start bringing on guests. But I really want to become more comfortable with this. So now that I'm here, let me explain a little bit about what is the Sub Creators channel. Where if you take a look at the YouTube channel of the Sub Creators, you're going to see a number of videos that I have already done. I've done a couple of graphic novel reviews. I've read some poetry. I've created some things that really have no classification. It was my plan to do live streaming all along with the subject matter of creativity. Creativity from the perspective of the word Christian is really loaded nowadays. I could say Christian creativity, but the word Christian really doesn't mean what it used to in years past, maybe even hundreds of years past. A biblical perspective would be more of what I'm thinking of. Now, some people out there may hear me say that and go, why in heaven's name would you do that? Why would you do the Bible and creativity? You're taking creativity and you're going to turn it into a Sunday school lesson. You're going to make it boring. That's not my intention. I hope I do not make it. In fact, I think if you look at things in the correct perspective, you're not going to find that this is boring at all. This is the roots of creation, of humanity, of the building blocks of the universe. Thinking about God, thinking about creation, thinking about salvation, thinking about things like sacrifice and changing from the heart out. These are all matters of creation. These are all matters of creativity. And the best way to see these things is through a biblical lens. The problem is most people think of the Bible as this old book with a lot of poems and verse, and then long lists of people that may or may not have existed thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. A book of old myths and a book of rules and regulations that really don't apply to anybody nowadays because we are enlightened. We have had people like Marx and Freud and Darwin and Nietzsche saying what they've said, that we have progressed beyond a biblical perspective. We're beyond the idea of God. But from a perspective of someone like me, and I'm somebody that does not fit in very well in many different categories. I'm not what you could really call a very churchy person. I am in church a lot. I contribute to the church that I go to. I have preached sermons. And I routinely do audio visual work. I do video editing, much like you would see on the Sub Creators, but It's more along the lines of lyric videos that people can sing in worship services, worship music. So everything that I do, my primary thing that I do is I write. I'm a writer. I've wanted to be a full-time professional writer, maybe artist on the side. I've actually had quite the progression of things that I've wanted to do, quote unquote, over my lifetime. But writing seems to be the most powerful thing that I can do. It's the most effective thing that I can do. Everything else, I can daydream a lot, like a lot of people, like a lot of creative people. I can always daydream that I can stand up in front of an audience and sing and, bring them to their feet, or I can act. And again, I can bring an audience to its feet, clapping for me. Yay, yay, yay. What a great performance. But in the end, the biggest thing that I can do is I can write. I pour thoughts and feelings into my writing. And when I think of the writing that went into the Bible, this is some of the best writing out there. If people, some of your academics, some have, even if they're not believers, they don't believe in God. They don't believe in Jesus. They don't believe in heaven or hell, God's demons, or anything like that. They don't believe that we're anything more than just meat. This is all there is the flesh. But yet, they read the Bible and they recognize it is spectacular writing. And it's spectacular writing, poetry, psalms, songs that were meant to be put to music that are lyrics on their own. It's poetry, the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, all these books of the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Books like the Acts, books like Romans, written by the Apostle Paul. The book of Romans and some of the other letters that he wrote, that the Apostle Paul wrote to various churches around the world when Christianity was just getting its footing in the world. It's some of the greatest persuasive writing out there. It is clear, it is concise, it is not the ravings of a fool. It makes incredible claims in today's materialist world, but it's clear and concise. It's great writing. So I believe that seeing things through a biblical lens, not just looking at the Bible at its as literature or as a historical document or as an artifact. Seeing it as an agent of reality, an explanation of reality. It's an eye-opener. It helps you to see the world in ways that you never thought that you would think of. If you really do read the Bible and keep an open mind, even if you don't believe it, and I would encourage you to believe what it says because it is real. But if you do that, if you just read it for its literature, it will expand your thinking. It will challenge you, certainly. Some things you may read in it and go, oh, that's BS. That's silly. There's no way. Or to require people to do X, Y, and Z. That's not necessary. But to throw the Bible out, to ignore it, and this is something that we have learned to do. I call myself a writer. I call myself author J.D. Gunter. I put that before my name in a lot of different instances to remind myself that this is something that I have. This is a gift that I've been given. I have written a number of things. I may talk about some of that in some upcoming uh, streams that I do here, some upcoming episodes. But I call myself author J.D. Gunter to remind myself of what it is that God has given me, this gift of writing. Pardon me. Kind of a ham-handed cough muting of the mic there. But what's really needed? What's really needed for me is to remind myself that this isn't a hobby. When I write, when I think deeply, this is something that I was meant to do. I've been given these things for a reason. I've been given these things to communicate ideas to the world. I also believe that all creative people, and this goes back to the beginning, the beginnings of this channel, the beginnings of the ideas for this channel. I believe that all creative people were meant to communicate something. I have been thinking about this literally since 1989, and that would have been my junior year of college. 1989 for me at that point in my life was a very, very difficult year, and for a number of reasons. And because of the difficulty of that time, I was forced to think about many things. I was forced to think about creativity. I was forced to think about why did I have the ability to write or to draw or to speak or to do all of these things? What is the nature of these things? Or what does all of this have to do with God? To understand why I do what I do, and not just the setting up of this channel, the sub-creators, but why have I been thinking about this for so long? Well, it really started. I have always been a creative person. A lot of people can make that same claim, but for whatever reason, my creativity, my imagination has always been there as the central thing about who I am. There are other facets to me as well. There's social, mechanical, things that I think of beyond just, creativity or imaginative subjects. But the one that just seems to keep me grounded is using my imagination to think of silly stuff, what some people would deem silly stuff. When I was a kid, I used to draw all the time. My favorite thing in the world, I had two favorite things in the world when I was very, very young. I'm going to say early grade school, kindergarten, early grade school, and even before kindergarten. I loved ghosts, monsters, dinosaurs, things like that. There was like a lot of cities in America, the local television station that one of the three big local television stations, you had your ABC, CBS, and NBC affiliates, and then of course your PBS station. And the NBC, the local NBC affiliate, every Saturday afternoon, when it wasn't preempted by sports or some other kind of programming, KHQ Channel 6, the NBC affiliate, would play the Saturday afternoon creature feature. They would play all of the old monster movies, from the Universal monsters to big bug movies from the 1950s, alien invasion movies, and Godzilla movies. Those were my favorite. Absolutely my favorite. I was particular to 50s monsters, sci-fi monsters. That was my big thing. I loved monsters. I loved documentaries about Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. I loved dinosaurs. I loved movies about dinosaurs. I had models of dinosaurs and little plastic dinosaurs. It was hard to find monster toys, but I could find them every now and then. But I would draw monsters all the time. The other thing that I would really, really love is cartoons, especially Saturday morning cartoons. Star Trek, the animated series, things from Filmation and Hanna-Barbera. I just loved Saturday morning cartoons. But the kind of cartoon that I always looked forward to were the Charlie Brown cartoons that would be shown on CBS in the evenings. The ones that would always start out with the special that would go dun 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 dun, you know. And that always meant that word special that would spin around and around with that grandiose music in the background. In fact, a lot of YouTubers and even other media people have taken that. I don't know if that's become public property, but they'll use that for the opening of their YouTube shows and things like that. But my hero was Charles Schulz, the creator of Charlie Brown, Snoopy, Linus, all of the Peanuts characters. And my desire was to be a cartoonist. That was the first thing that I wanted to be. Till about junior high or so. I figured that I would be a cartoonist, an artist, something like that. And I would draw, I would doodle, I would cartoon, you would always see me on the floor of my parents' place next to the heat register, which was on the floor, and I would be there by the heat register with a piece of paper and drawing, and then later on they got me a desk to actually sit at, because they felt bad for me sitting there on the floor on the carpet like that. Then along about junior high, I discovered books. I discovered writers. Like, my favorite was Ray Bradbury. Lady at the church that I went to, her name, God bless her, was Mrs. Gregg. She had two things that a friend of mine and I that would always go over to her house, sometimes before, sometimes after church, with our families or just by ourselves. If Mrs. Gregg was watching us, she had a closet with a big cardboard box full of comic books. And her son had left this bunch of comics behind when he went to college. It was like, I don't need these things anymore. I'm a big guy. I don't need this. I'm going to college. And there was some really rare stuff. I've seen rare I've held rare issues of the Silver Surfer, the first appearance of Mephisto, and things like that. The other thing that Mrs. Gregg's son, his name was Mark Gregg, he left a bunch of paperback and some hardback books. Among these, there were books by Robert Bloch, Ray Bradbury, books like the story collection that the short story that the movie Rollerball was based on. I read that. Books by Harlan Ellison. Very, very graphic stuff for an 11-year-old kid. But I discovered reading, and I realized that I loved the idea of drawing with words even more than drawing pictures. So about that time, I switched in about sixth grade or so, fifth, sixth grade. I started figuring I'm going to be a writer. I want to be like Ray Bradbury. Just like my childhood hero was Charles M. Schulz, my adolescent hero was Ray Bradbury, The Martian Chronicles. The October Country was a huge one. All of these insane stories, but they were so beautifully written, and they were so filled with humanity. I was too young to recognize it, but I knew that there was something about these stories. I knew there was something going on. I knew that there was something going on there, and I loved these stories by Ray Bradbury. And then after that, I discovered Stephen King, like a lot of guys my age, people my age discovered. Mine was the television adaptation directed by director Tobe Hooper of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist. He directed, there was on CBS a TV movie adaptation of Stephen King's Salem's Lot. And before that, I thought that Stephen King was just this guy because of Carrie and The Shining. I just thought he wrote about psychic children. Like, really? Whatever. I don't care. I saw Salem's Lot. It scared me to death. Reggie Nalder as Barlow the vampire, this bald, rat-like green vampire with these long skeletal fingers, and he didn't speak. He just grunted and in this hollow, dead voice, and the teeth, and all the vampires, not just Barlow, but all of the people of the town of Salem's Lot, just like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, they were becoming vampires, one after the other, after the other, after the other. And that story, that made me a Stephen King fan. So I had my parents buy me the book of Salem's Lot, and I read it. And I knew that, okay, I have to do this. I have to do this. So from junior high, sixth grade, through middle school, through most of high school, maybe even up to about my senior year. It's like, I'm going to be a writer. And even beyond, I started to go to college. I went to a private college that my dad worked at. He was security supervisor. And this was a pretty prestigious place. But I thought, I'm going to learn how to write. But when I got my driver's license, suddenly I started having something pull me in another direction. When I got my driver's license, I figured out I could go to the movies anytime I wanted to. My family didn't go to the movies very much because they were expensive, and my parents, my dad especially, was very conservative and did not like the idea of paying a lot of money, even for back then, to listen to people cuss, and then inappropriate situations, and maybe even if the rating of the movie was hard enough, there would be really inappropriate stuff. So my dad was like, I'm not going to go see these movies. So suddenly I have my driver's license, 16 years old, 17, and I'm like, I can go to the movies anytime I want. First movie, right out of the gate, Pale Rider. Clint Eastwood's Pale Rider, summer of 1985. Second one, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. I started seeing them one after the other. I saw Fright Night. All of these movies in 1985. And suddenly I started thinking, what if there was this horror movie magazine called Fangoria that would appear at various newsstands of like local grocery stores, and I would read these articles, and I was seeing these movies all the time, and I started asking the question, what if I did that? What if instead of being a writer, what if I was a director? What if I could do all these things? Man, that would be cool. I'd be making monster movies just like the kinds that I would see on Saturday afternoon. Creature feature. And I became a cinema bug. So I would think about creative stuff all the time. That was what I was going to do with my life. I wanted to get on airplanes and fly from city to city to city. I wanted to get out of my hometown of Spokane, Washington so darn bad. I wanted to travel the world. I wanted to fly from place to place. I wanted to do all these things. And I knew that if I was an author, if I was a movie maker especially, I would be able to do that. And that would be so cool to be able to do. The thing that always held me back and had me question that was my church upbringing. See, growing up, I had two worlds when it came to my faith. I had the world of my imagination, and I had the world of church. I loved monsters. I drew monsters all the time when I was little, and sometimes I would draw monsters in church, and I would get scolded for it. You shouldn't be drawing monsters in church. That doesn't have anything to do with Jesus. Jesus wouldn't want you to be drawing monsters in his house. But these were church people speaking, so I didn't question it. I really have, especially in my younger days, I was not the kind of person to question authority when they spoke. Because these are the people that God put in my life for me to follow. And then I found myself running into these two parts of me. The world of my imagination and the world of church would clash. And the older that I got, and the more that I started to think about Okay, what exactly am I going to do when I hit the real world? When I get out of school, and especially when I get out of college, what am I going to do? And I had pretty much thought, I think I'm going to go to Hollywood, California, because I really think I've got what it takes to be a John Carpenter, a Toby Hooper, a James Cameron, maybe a Steven Spielberg. I don't know. Good grief. But I knew that I could be someone like that. I knew that I could be a Wes Craven. I knew that I could be somebody that could do a horror movie and an action movie and a wacky comedy and things like that, just like the kind of movies that I loved. But there was always that thing, what if God doesn't want me to do that? So I would wrestle with it all the time. In the 1980s, when I became an adolescent, we got a new pastor in. And this pastor, he had some good points, but he was a fairly unstable, he was an unstable individual. And the way that he would preach, the messages that he would deliver, and the way that he dealt with his congregation was not very healthy. He was the kind of man that was more obsessed about what the devil was doing in the world than what God was doing in the hearts of his followers and in the hearts of the people of the church. He was a very isolated individual, both physically and mentally, emotionally, and spiritually as well. He was kind of like a hermit. He was very mistrustful of everything around him. He seemed, when you would first meet him, he was a nice guy. But he wasn't a very nice guy. He had his good points, but he brought it in the 1980s, in the late 70s through the 80s. There was a movement afoot within very, very, very what was called fundamentalist Christian circles. And it was advanced by television personality preachers like, say, Paul Crouch or Gary Greenwald of the Eagle's Nest. And they would always be doing these shows about how this toy, this musical band, this series of movies, this cultural fad was all Satan's way of getting a hold of people's minds. And you talk to very many 50-somethings like myself that were teenagers in the 50s, and you mention record burnings, and they will kind of go, I don't want to talk about that. We'll get very physically uncomfortable and embarrassed. In my church, this pastor who is in charge of the church that I went to, he started preaching messages. Actually, he really didn't preach. He just had these tapes that he would get. I think he might have got them from another church member, or he ordered them through the mail or something like that. And these tapes advanced the idea that certain rock and roll songs had messages backwards. When you played a record backwards, you would hear certain messages in them. And there were some instances of things that sounded like words and phrases, and things that sounded like somebody was saying Satan's a really cool guy or something like that. It didn't help that, say, in the 1960s, the Beatles were actually they were hiding little messages backwards, but that was just part of them being creative and subversive. And then you have the famous one from Queen, Another One Bites the Dust, where they very intentionally put, it's fun to smoke marijuana if you played a certain part of Another One Bites the Dust backwards. Those were intentional. But what these tapes were implying is that Satan was putting messages that only you would be able to hear if you played records backwards. And because they were backwards, they called it backwards masking. Because these messages were backwards according to these tapes, the sermons on these tapes, that it would get these messages into your head unconsciously, subconsciously. And the more you played Stairway to Heaven, and Stairway to Heaven has something in it that sounds like My Sweet Satan, blah, blah, blah. Well, not really blah, 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 but a phrase with that in it. And if you heard that unconsciously backwards, it would go through your conscious mind, and then you would start to think, oh, Satan is my sweet Satan. That's what it was saying. It was mind control. It was demonic mind control. So all throughout my adolescence, this divide between the world of my imagination and the world of church started to get further and further and further apart. Because they were also doing stuff like Dungeons and Dragons is of the devil. It's getting people to cast spells and to act like wizards and warlocks, and to be pagans and to worship other gods. Did some of that go on? I don't know. People are stupid. But was it a satanic plot? I don't think so. No. I think that the purpose of the church is to spread the gospel, meaning the good news. And the good news is God wants humanity to meet him. God and humanity can come together. And they can do that because Jesus, God's Son, came to earth, sacrificed himself. He allowed himself to be crucified. God brought him back after 3 days. That death and resurrection gives humanity a chance to be with God. Every man, woman, and child has that decision to make. That is the message that churches are supposed to bring to the world. These people like Paul Crouch and Gary Greenwald and my own pastor at that time were not. Yeah, they say, yeah. We're trying to spread the gospel, but we're also fighting the devil and his schemes. I'm editing. I'm really wanting to say some some very some cynical things, but it would not be helpful. I'm just going to shut up. People were becoming distracted. People in the Baptist faith and in other Christian denominations, especially your more conservative, quote unquote conservative ones, they were losing their way because there were all of these showmen that were distracting people from their real true calling, which is to share the gospel, the good news that salvation is offered to every man, every woman, every child. It is free for you to take. It doesn't matter how awful you feel about yourself, whether consciously or unconsciously. It doesn't matter what you've done. You could be the most horrible person in the world, and you could go, I don't want to be this horrible person anymore. I want to be better. I want to be changed. I want my heart to change. You go to God and say, I'm sorry. I messed it up, and I messed it up bad. Can you give me another chance? And he will, and he wants to. That's the good news. That's the gospel. That is what was being forgotten. And the result was myself, and I don't know how many others, with our imaginations being alienated from ourselves. I can't really speak for anybody else, really. Myself, I can say, I was very conflicted. And the more I started to head toward, I want to go to Hollywood. Doggone it, I love movies. I want to make movies. I really do. It all came to a head in January of 1988. The previous fall, I kept running into these people that were like, it was one incident after another of people going, you know what God thinks about this movie or that actor? Or if it wasn't a church person, it was somebody in college classes, taking psychology classes, going, you know what it does to you to watch Arnold Schwarzenegger movies? It causes you to be violent and want to kill people. And within like a handful, within 2 months, I had received so many messages, and I had this tug of war between my world of church and my world of the imagination. And it had been going on for so long that during the fall of 1987, I took everything. I thought, God must be talking to me here. And I don't want to be left behind. I don't want him to forget me. I don't want him to turn his back on me. I don't want to be outside the gates of heaven. I don't want that. I gave my life. My mom sat me down in the second grade on a Tuesday afternoon after I came home from school. And she explained who Jesus was. She explained how and why he died, why God had him come, and about salvation and how I could pray for salvation, what it all meant. And it was all very simple for me, a second grader, to understand. And I did. And ever since that time, I had been growing spiritually, very, very slowly. But that especially resulted in that tug of war. And then finally, in the fall of 1987, does the fact that I like these things mean that I'm evil? Maybe I don't have God's salvation. Maybe he's just impatiently sitting there with his arms folded and his foot tapping, looking at me. I don't know what I'm going to do with you. You won't stop watching A Nightmare on Elm Street. I don't know what to do with you. So I took everything and I threw it away. I took all my books, everything except the Ray Bradbury books, because they were academic. Because I was still in college at that point. But all my Stephen King books, I threw them out or sold them. All my monster movie stuff, all my role-playing game stuff. I just didn't want to be left behind. I didn't want God to turn his back on me, to run out of patience with me. Just say, I'm not going to do this anymore. So I threw it all away. And then in January of 1988, I had a college professor who actually was friends with a kind of a big time director. And he taught this college professor, he taught a class in modern American cinema. And I watched movies like The Godfather, Singing in the Rain, movies like Terrence Malick's, I think it's Terrence Malick's, Badlands, man. Diner, Barry Levinson, all of these movies. And I'm like, I want to do this so badly. But then with one thing and another, I just, no, okay, all right. All right. And I stopped thinking about it. And I was dead on my feet for months and months and months. Fast forward to fall of 1988. Summer of 1988, I was still watching movies. I remember watching The Great Outdoors, Die Hard. Oh my goodness, Die Hard. That changed everything. And I was wrestling back and forth. Oh man, I just want to make movies. I want to make something that big. But I had pretty much resigned. Nah, it's not going to happen. I'll talk about that maybe a little bit more. But fall of 1988, I was lost. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought maybe I could be funny. I could learn how to be funny. I could be a comedian. I could tell jokes. No. Bad idea. Bad idea, Seymour. I took a class. It was supposed to be a science fiction class, a science fiction literature class. That was what that was what the course catalog described it as. In the church that I went to, this pastor actually liked Star Trek for the most part. He liked science fiction because it was grounded in reality, supposedly. And it also was not based on magic, because magic was pagan practices made popular. So I saw this science fiction literature course being offered, and I signed up for it. And it turned out to be a fantasy literature course. Oh no. Oh no. But I went along. For some reason, I didn't back out of it. I didn't get out. I started reading books like James Branch Cabell's Jurgen. Really? You Christian boy, you're going to read that? The Wood Beyond the World by William Morris. Books like that. But then I read a book by a guy by the name of George MacDonald. George MacDonald was a Scottish preacher and poet. And he loved Gothic atmosphere. He loved fairy tales. He loved magical stories. The book Phantastes that he wrote. He also wrote other ones like The Princes and the Goblins, the At the Back of the North Wind, and a number of others. I remember that when it came time for the instructor to talk about this book, he talked about, and I don't know if this was an apocryphal story or not, but he talked about how a young George MacDonald he got a job as a boy in a library in this Gothic castle. And the books that he read there in the Gothic atmosphere of this castle, I think it might have been a German castle that he somehow was able to be in this library and learning. But during this lecture, for some reason, all of the talk about Gothic atmosphere and castles and fantastic stuff, as I was writing my notes, up above in the blank spaces at the top of the note page, where there's this big blank space, I started drawing all of these scenes of moonlit hillsides, just like the kind that I grew up around and going to school at. Empty fields with moonlight casting shadows everywhere. And it's like a part of me that I had shoved down and said, "You shut up. You keep down." It suddenly, I let it go just a little bit and it started to breathe. Oh my gosh, that feels good. And it was from there I started to pay closer attention to authors like C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, as a boy, I couldn't stand him. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, yeah, I knew it was about Jesus, except he was a lion. It was all like the Bible, but hey, if I want to read something, I want to read something about vampires, okay? I don't want to read something about Sunday school lessons with fauns and satyrs and centaurs. Don't hand me that. Don't hand me that. But because I was desperate enough, it's like, tell me more, tell me more. I started to learn about J.R.R. Tolkien's his Catholicism, his Catholic brand of Christianity, if you want to call it that. But I was just desperate. God, there's got to be something I can rely on here. There's got to be something that gives me permission as a Christian to like using my imagination. And that had me reading biographies of C.S. Lewis. And I got him. Finally, I understood him a lot more. Biographies of J.R.R. Tolkien and his philology. It taught me more about writing than creative writing courses. I was in the middle of when I was reading Tolkien's biography, and I learned about his love for words and what he could do with them. I was taking a poetry course, and I started out, and my poor instructor was like, you're writing prose, but you're arranging it in these poetry stanzas. This is not really good. You're better in this. But then when I read the biography of Tolkien, it's like, oh, I get it. It's like music. You were arranging words like music, of course. And biographies of George MacDonald. I learned a lot. But I learned that there is something called a sanctified imagination. That God does not, that there's no such thing as my former pastor's arguments about magic and everything. It's like, well, it clearly says in the Bible that if you feel convicted, it's just like eating meat from the marketplace. Are you worried that it could be that it might have been sacrificed by an idol? On one hand, you could say idols are nothing. They're pieces of stone and wood and jewelry. It's just meat, for crying out loud. But on the other hand, if you're seriously worried that you are eating meat that has been given to an idol, then you should not eat it. But if you honestly are like, the heck's an idol? It's a statue. It doesn't mean anything. Every man, woman, and child has to make up their own mind about these things. Now, if you know, the Bible very clearly says that if you know that you have a brother or sister, a fellow believer who is going to be misled, they shouldn't be eating it, and you shouldn't be eating meat from the marketplace that may or may not have been sacrificed to an idol in front of them, because it's going to make them stumble. You don't know what it's going to do to them. Same thing with Dungeons and Dragons. Same thing with, you're not going to go looking into a crystal ball. You're not going to go consulting the spirits. You're not going to go honestly doing tarot cards to find out who you may or may not marry, or whether or not you're going to make a lot of money and get famous. That's foolishness. That's stupidity. No, God does not want you to do that. But playing an elf that casts a sleep spell on a dragon and so the dragon falls asleep, hey, you just did the gaming version of a fairy tale. You told a story collectively, and you did it with dice or cards or rock, paper, scissors, or whatever randomized way you have determining events. So I started to think, what does all this mean? What does all this mean? So in 1989, I was still wrestling with a lot of stuff. A lot of it had to do with things that this former pastor of mine had said right before he left. Right before he left my church, he was very irresponsible with some things he said. And basically, they made me very, very paranoid about things. Very, very superstitious and afraid. So I would think a lot because of these biographies of these guys. I started doing my own research. Reading the actual, Grimm's fairy tales and things like that. And from that point on, I really started to think about creativity. Why do I have these abilities? What am I supposed to do with them? Now, unfortunately, I went back with the idea of I'm going to go to Hollywood, California, and I'm going to sell screenplays and I'm going to become the next big thing. But no. That I do believe God said, no, that's not what I've got for you. And when I think about the state the Hollywood is in now, that was a mercy. It was a severe mercy, to use a phrase from C.S. Lewis, but it was still a mercy. Who knows what sort of a scumbag creep I would have turned into. With all of my insecurities, oh my goodness, they would have chewed me up and spat me out. Hollywood would have been the chipper shredder. I would have gone in one end and right out the other in pieces. So I have been thinking about creativity for a long time. What does it mean? God spoke the world, the universe, into existence. He spoke it into existence. We are reflections of Him. That's in anything that we make. God created everything with His hands. And whenever we create anything, it doesn't need to be something quote unquote creative. It could be jewelry. It could be a house. It could be a book. It could be a stage performance. It could be a movie. It could be a video. It could be a live stream just like this one. It could be a drawing. It could be a comic book. It could be a leather saddle. We create things. We fashion things. God spoke everything into being from nothing. We can't do that. What we do is we take the materials that He has provided us with, and we create it, and we fashion. We don't really technically create anything. We fashion things out of what we've got, out of pen and paper, out of an electronic keyboard, out of a camera and some editing software, out of clay, out of wood. We grow plants up from the ground, like my good friend Levi, or a full-fledged farmer like my good friend Ernie Sims. Carpenters, architects. When we put our thumbprint on the world, we are doing what God has bidden us to do. He has said, consult with me, work with me. I spoke this creation into existence. Now, go into it and do something good with it. Grow things in it. Build things in it. Make changes. Challenge. Don't be disrespectful and don't be sinful, but challenge. Challenge yourselves. Go beyond what's been already done. That's what it means to be creative. From a biblical perspective, that's what it means. There's a passage in Genesis where the story of Joseph and his brothers, the story of Joseph, the musical Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, it's a real story. It's not just a flashy Broadway musical. It's something that actually happened. A guy by the name of Joseph, his brothers took him, made it look like a lion had got him because they hated him, because they thought that he was talking about how much better he was than them. And he was just saying, hey, God gave me this dream where one day you guys are going to bow in front of me. I don't know. He could have been saying it cocky. I wasn't there, but the Bible doesn't really indicate that he was saying anything untruth. Of course he wasn't. You read the story and sure enough. So Joseph's brothers, they take Joseph, they take this beautiful coat that his father had given him, their father had given him, didn't give them anything. That made them really angry. And then he goes off and says, one day you're going to bow in front of me. So they cold cock him, throw him in the bottom of a well, take the coat, tear it up, kill a goat and put blood all over it. They take it to their father and go, oh my goodness, it was horrible. Lion got him. Nothing we could do. Nothing we can do. So they take him. They sell him to some slave traders. They take him to Egypt. Poor Joseph, he suffers one thing and another thing and then another thing. And then at the very end, he becomes this number 2, number 3 from the Pharaoh himself in Egypt. This big time ruler, because he's able to interpret dreams. God gave him that ability. It's all there in the Bible. It's all there in Genesis. It's there for you to read. And then his brothers come because there's a famine in their land. And they go to Egypt to get some grain to trade for it. Joseph basically plays a big trick on them, a mean trick, but he's kind of entitled to it. They did leave him for dead and then sell him to slavers. But he makes them think that they're all in trouble because he reveals himself. He's dressed up. He's dressed up like an Egyptian. They can't tell the difference. And he's this big Egyptian ruler. And he, like I said, he plays this trick on them. And then he reveals himself. Hey, it's me. You're not in trouble. Gotcha. It's your brother. I just want you to know I love you. And they're like, oh my gosh. And they bow in front of him. And then they all go. Why are you having mercy on us? We deserve the worst. And then Joseph says, what men meant for evil, men meaning his brothers, but men meant for evil, God meant for good. And God actually used that awful thing that happened to Joseph to help with a famine in the land of Egypt and all the surrounding areas. God was able to help Joseph bring about big changes. And so Joseph brought his brothers and his father up into Egypt. And that's what I think of, that what man means for evil, God can use for good. That is an example of biblical creation. God can take our worst and God can take the worst, our worst, any worst that's out there, and he can make it good. He can take any human being, the worst human being. If Adolf Hitler decided, oh my goodness, what have I done? God, will you help me? Will you save me? I don't deserve it. God would have saved him. That's hard to think about. So that's the reason for the sub-creators. I want to talk about creativity. My hope is to actually bring people on. It would be cool if I could talk to various creators, various writers or movie people or actors or comic book people, I don't know. I would love to do that. But I would also like to talk to people I would like to talk to somebody that makes wallets. I would like to talk to a carpenter. I'd like to talk to a musician. And I would like to talk to them about what they do. How do they feel that what they do is a reflection of the first creator, God? How is God using what they do for his purposes? All right. Thanks for spending some time with me. Like I said, I'm going to try to do this at least once a week. I will try to keep it consistent, maybe on like 9 o'clock on Saturdays. I will let everybody know if and when this changes, but we'll see how it goes. Thank you very much for spending time with me here. Have a good night.